Hey guys, today's video lecture topic is going to be on homeostasis. Make sure you're filling out your notes organizer as you watch this video, so pause, stop, rewatch as many times as you need to in order to make sure you answer every question. So if today's topic is homeostasis, and that's what we're going to be talking about, I think it's probably important to go ahead and define that term. What is homeostasis? Homeostasis is the body's ability to maintain relatively stable internal environment despite the fact that the external environment is continuously changing. Why does the body need to be able to do this? The body needs to be able to do this because cells actually function best within a very certain specific, very small range. So the seesaw image here is kind of what your body is doing in order to maintain homeostasis. It's this delicate balance of making sure cells don't go out of their normal, typical range. So things that need to stay within homeostasis include the body's temperature, blood pH, water balance, ion balance, blood pressure, removal of waste, blood sugar, calcium levels, and so many more things need to maintain relatively stable within the body in order for your body to function at its peak. So the word homeostasis literally means unchanging, like the word parts, homeostasis, means stopping or unchanging. But the funny thing is that homeostasis is not unchanging. In fact, it's a very dynamic or changing state of equilibrium. So it's this constant moving balance of maintaining those stable internal conditions. Balance is achieved by varying internal conditions, but within relatively narrow limits. When the body is in homeostasis, its needs are being met and it's functioning smoothly. When it's out of homeostasis balance, so in homeostatic imbalance, we use the term disease. The term disease simply means not within homeostasis. Going out of homeostasis, going out of those narrow boundaries are dangerous to the human body and can often be life-threatening. So this dynamic or changing equilibrium is basically this back and forth of going out of range above and then going within range and then going below range and then bringing it back in range and then going above range, just like a seesaw, okay? The goal is to try and keep it balanced like this, but in order to do that, you kind of always have to be going back and forth. So you have a deviation from whatever the set point is. Then you have some sort of corrective action to bring it back towards the set point, but then that goes below the set point, so you need to bring it back up. This is what the typical homeostatic feedback loop looks like. Every organ system is going to play a role in homeostasis. The nervous system, the endocrine system are constantly communicating and then working within all of your systems to maintain balance by using various organs and structures within the human body. Communication within the body is going to be essential so that we maintain staying in this healthy range here, staying within homeostasis. Going out of homeostasis, going into that imbalance is when you have disease. Okay, so homeostasis typically happens within a certain feedback loop. And that feedback loop always has the same sort of parts. So we're going to go ahead and define the parts of a typical homeostatic feedback mechanism. The terms you need to know in a typical homeostatic feedback loop are variable, receptor, stimuli, afferent pathway, control center, effector, and efferent pathway. So we're going to define these and you're going to match them on your notes organizer. So the thing you're trying to control, the thing you're trying to maintain within homeostasis is what's called the variable, the factor or event being controlled. The homeostatic process is going to kick in when some sort of stimulus causes a change in the variable. So blood temperature, for example, is a variable that you're trying to maintain. Blood sugar, calcium levels, that sort of thing. Then you have the receptor. The receptor is going to be some type of sensor, okay, so like a nervous system cell, for example, some sort of neuron or receptor that monitors the environment and responds to stimuli by sending information to the control center. Okay, so some sort of sensory cell, that is your receptor that's constantly like feeling out, what's happening with the blood sugar or what's happening with the calcium levels. And then they're going to send that information to the control center. So the information that's being sent from the receptor to the control center is what we call afferent or input information. So it's flowing from the receptor to the control center along what we call the afferent pathway. And I always remember this because the afferent pathway or the afferent information approaches the control center. So then we have the control center, and the control center is probably the most important part of any homeostatic feedback loop. The control center is the structure in the human body that determines the set point at which the variable is to be maintained. This could be the brain, this could be an endocrine gland, but this is what determines what that range is. So it analyzes the input that it receives from the receptor cells and determines the appropriate response or output for the effectors. Okay, so then we have information that flows from the control center to the effector, the thing that's actually going to respond to the change in the variable. That's our output information or efferent information. So output information flows from the control center to the effector or effectors along the efferent pathway. And I always remember this because efferent starts with E, so efferent information exits the control center. So the afferent information is approaching the control center from the receptor to the control center. The efferent information is exiting the control center, so going from the control center to the effectors. Okay, so that brings us to our effectors. The effectors are the part of the homeostatic feedback loop that are actually executing the necessary change. They are the things actually responding to the initial stimulus and bringing, hopefully, the body back into homeostasis. Okay, so executes the necessary changes in order to adjust the variable. This is going to be an organ. This is going to be a gland or a muscle. Okay, things that are actually doing something in response to that initial stimulus. The receptor is really just sending information. The control center is deciding what to do with that information, and then the effector or effectors are what's actually doing something to cause a response to the initial stimulus. Okay, so the response returns the variable to, hopefully, a stable state. Now, there are different types of feedback mechanisms. There are negative feedback mechanisms and there are positive feedback mechanisms. Negative feedback mechanisms cause the variable to change in a way that is opposite from the initial stimulus. So if the initial stimulus is something rising in a negative feedback loop, the response is going to be to decrease. So it does not matter if the initial stimulus is rising or lowering or whatever. A negative feedback just means that the response, the body's response, is the opposite of whatever the initial stimulus was. That's a negative feedback loop. A positive feedback loop or a positive feedback mechanism means that the body continues the initial response, the same direction. So causes the variable to change in the same direction as the initial disturbance. So if the initial stimulus is an increase in something, then in a positive feedback loop, the body continues to increase and increase and increase. Okay, the same direction as the initial stimulus. Most homeostatic mechanisms in the body are going to be negative feedback loops. So honestly, if you're not sure, if you get asked a question, is this an example of a negative or positive? Go ahead and put negative because chances are you're right. Almost every feedback loop in the body responds in a negative feedback way. So homeostasis is maintained by responding in the opposite direction or shutting off or reducing the intensity of whatever that original stimulus was. Okay, so here's some examples. Body temperature, withdrawal reflex, control of blood volume, heart rate, blood pressure, the depth of your breathing, oxygen levels in your blood, carbon dioxide levels, nutrients in blood, and more. Okay, so almost all of the feedback loops in your body are negative feedback mechanisms. So just for an example here, carbon dioxide levels. If carbon dioxide levels get too low in your body, then your body's response is to increase them. If carbon dioxide levels get too high in your blood, your body's response is to lower them, right? The response is in the opposite direction of the initial stimulus, which means it's a negative feedback loop. A positive feedback mechanism, there really aren't very many of them in the body, but what they do is they enhance or accelerate the original stimulus, and these are typically controlling infrequent events in the body. So like not things that are existing in your body at all times. So for example, labor contractions are a typical go-to example of a positive feedback loop. You have the initial contractions that are caused by a stimulus, which cause a hormone to release. That hormone actually makes more contractions. Continue, continue, continue. So the original stimulus is contracting, producing the hormone oxytocin. The body's response is to produce more oxytocin and to make more contractions. We need that to happen in order for the baby to be born. That is a positive feedback loop. Blood clotting is an example. So when you have your platelets attached to the vessel, they actually signal for more platelets, more and more platelets. So blood clotting is an example of a positive feedback loop. Lactation, when the baby nurses, that signals to the body to make more milk, okay? So more of the original stimulus, that's a positive feedback loop. Okay, so now we're gonna practice. You're gonna read through the various homeostatic scenarios and you're gonna identify the homeostatic components. Then you're gonna identify whether the example that I give you is an example of a positive or negative feedback mechanism. Now, the answers are going to be on the next few slides. I really want you to try and do these on your own before you just look at the answers. So pause, stop, attempt on your own so that you can really see if you understand how the homeostatic feedback loops work. Can you identify the different components? So our first example is thermoregulation, your body's ability to maintain that internal temperature of ideally somewhere around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So when the body temperature rises too high, your body does natural things in order to bring it back down. When your body temperature gets too low, your body does certain things to bring it back up. Okay, so I'm not gonna read this because this is on your paper, but go ahead and read this and then pause on this slide so that you can see if you can identify the different components of this particular homeostatic feedback loop. All right, so pause. Okay, so here are the answers. The variable that you're trying to maintain in thermoregulation is body temperature. The original stimulus in this case was a rise in body temperature. The receptor that sensed the change were those heat-sensitive thermoreceptors. And then the afferent information or input information were those neural impulses sent from the thermoreceptors to the hypothalamus, which means the hypothalamus is our control center. Then we have the output information or efferent information, which are those signals that were sent from the hypothalamus to the blood vessels and the sweat glands, which means the blood vessels and the sweat glands are our effectors. And then finally, this is an example of a negative feedback loop. There was an increase in temperature, the body's response was to decrease it. That's an opposite reaction, which means it is a negative feedback loop. Our next example is childbirth. So I'm not going to read this because this is on your paper, but go ahead and pause on this slide, read through the information, and see if you can identify the components of this particular feedback loop. Okay, so the variable here is childbirth. That's what we're trying to maintain in a sense. The original stimulus was the baby pushing against the cervix. The receptors, what sensed that change, were the stretch receptors in the cervix. Okay, the input or afferent information were those neural impulses that were sent from the stretch receptors to the hypothalamus, which once again means the hypothalamus is our control center. So the hypothalamus decides what to do with that information, so it sends signals from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. So in this case, our pituitary gland is our effector. It's actually doing something, releasing the hormone that's going to cause a response to the initial stimulus. The response is to respond in the same way of the initial stimulus, right? You have contractions, which produces more contractions, more stretching. That is an example of a positive feedback loop. And then finally, we have blood sugar. So again, I'm not going to read this. You can read about how your body maintains blood sugar levels. So pause on this slide, attempt it on your own. And let's see how you did. The variable we're trying to maintain is the concentration of blood sugar. The initial stimulus in this case was a rise in blood glucose levels. The receptors were the beta cells of the pancreas. They sensed that change in the stimulus. And then they send information from the beta cells to the pancreas. So that's our input information. So while the receptors were found in the pancreas is also technically our control center. The pancreas causes insulin release from the pancreas to the liver and muscles, so that's our output information. So our effectors are the liver and the muscles, which actually cause a change in the blood sugar levels. This is an example of a negative feedback loop. The response is in the opposite direction of the initial stimulus.